very welcome guests to our oyster workshop. It's great that we've been able to finally put this on, because Christopher, I know, has had it in the offing for a long while, and tonight it's certainly going to come to fruition for us. So sit back, and we're going to learn from a couple of leading exponents of the art of oyster culture and oyster consumption. Tonight we've got Tristan Hugh-Jones here, oyster farmer extraordinaire, who's going to talk us through the culture of the oysters, both native and Pacific rocks. And then we have Katie Davidson, aka the Oyster Lady, who's come to talk to us about her interpretation of the oyster and how she engages with the consumer and puts the message out there about how we should be eating more oysters and extolling their multifarious benefits. So over to you two. Thank you very much.
Great.
Tristan.
Thank you very much. We're going to do a bit of a double act without too much rehearsal, but hopefully I'm going to talk about what I know more about, and then Katie's going to talk about what she knows more about. So hopefully it'll work pretty well. I'm going to talk about, there's so much to talk about and I don't know quite where to begin. I think probably questions and answers at the end, either at the end when we've both finished, is good, or if you need to interrupt halfway through, that's absolutely fine. But my speciality is breeding. There are two types of oysters. There's a rock oyster and there's a native oyster. And I was born on an oyster farm in Cork in Ireland, which my parents have been breeding and growing native oysters since about 1970. So I'm going to talk mostly about native oysters and my experience with native oysters and breeding native oysters. Up to the north, in the North Channel, there's a nice strip of water which is a good bottom, a good hard bottom, which is suitable for growing native oysters. So why did my parents go to Cork in 1969? My father studied agriculture. From a business model, it's a good one. It's good. You can have he applied for the rights to grow oysters in Cork Harbour. There was a public inquiry, and anyone who objected could come forward and say why they objected. But again, in those days, no one really objected. They were delighted to have someone using the sea. Everyone was enthusiastic that something would be done and grown, and so we have the rights to the oysters in Cork Harbour now for life, and that cost nothing. So we have the rights to grow oysters in Cork Harbour for everything. The food is in the sea, and my father thought we needed about 6 million in Cork Harbour, and then that would have worked. So this is our house where I was born in Ireland, the one on the right. We had a pond, but the problem with having one pond is you only get one sort of chance in the summer. So you need to fish the oyster at the right time of year, put it into the pond at the right time of year, hope the plankton in the pond is nice. Then you also have to hope that the weather is good to you, the sun is shining. If it's too hot, the algal bloom in the pond might go all wrong. If it's too cold, the larvae would die. So to reduce the risk of just this one pond, we built some more. This is huge earthworks in 78 roughly, building these ponds, and then the finished product is this site in Ireland, where it's the only place like it in Europe where we've now got 22 ponds, and that's our house with the original pond now. And the oyster bed is to the left hand side of the picture, running up and down to and from it. So the ponds, this is a close-up picture of the ponds. They're about 25 metres by 25 metres in size, and about 2 metres deep, a little bit more than 2 metres deep. They contain 1 million litres of water, which was easy for the sums, so that if you sample your oysters, which we do once or twice a day in the summer to watch how the larvae are growing, you can simply just, instead of saying you've got 1 per litre, you can casually say, yes, we've got 1 million oysters in the pond. They're lined with rubber, butyl rubber, and we pump water in, and there's a huge pipe for draining them, so you could drain 2 2 ponds in a day. It takes us longer to fill them. But they're now old, the rubber is perishing, and we crawl around on hands and knees repairing them. This is a picture of us harvesting parent oysters in the summer. We harvest them using that boat. You can see on the left-hand crane there is a dredge, and on the right-hand crane that is lifting off 1/2 ton of material from the seabed, which will contain oysters and also the other dead shell and weed and other bits from the shore, and then taken in a tractor onto a conveyor belt in the shed, so we can have more people to sort. What is exciting is that last year when we did it, we had the picture on the left is showing the different ages of oysters that we've fished up in one area for breeding oysters in last year's ponds. There has been a native oyster disease, and it wiped out all sorts of oysters in the UK in 1982, called Banamia. This disease has absolutely decimated European production everywhere. It was found in Essex. It was in Cornwall, and we didn't have it until there was a possible importation of oysters with the disease from France that came down to us in '87. So between the years of 1982, when England had no oysters, and we did have oysters, we had a very, very strong position in London, supplying native oysters to the London market. But the oysters that we've got from breeding in the ponds have started to show a resistance to this disease. And that's of huge excitement. This is just another few pictures of the ponds. We've either placed on trays into the ponds, which we've either done with a raft or swimming to get them in, or placed the broodstock on the ponds, on the pond floor. We would use maybe 600 to 1,000 oysters in a pond, and one of the benefits of this is throughout the entire pond production we would therefore use a couple of tons of oysters as broodstock, but it keeps the genetic makeup of the population that we're breeding more diverse. So we're breeding from a larger population, which would help the strain survive. I'm afraid the picture on the left is probably lousy. You can talk about that later. But it's showing native oysters at different stages of when we're breeding them. We watch them incredibly carefully on a daily basis in the sea to see how they're coming on. The oyster on the left, bottom left, is a normal oyster that is sort of coming into breeding. The two on the right have a slight milkiness around the edge of them, which is called white sick, when that's the eggs, the female eggs that are about to be fertilized, and the top left is one that is being fertilized, and they're ready to be released into the water. The larvae swim for 10 days, so when they're released into the ponds, the larvae swim in the pond for 10 days. So if the pond's got a leak, they'll wash out. If there's no food, they'll die. If the plankton is wrong, they'll die. If things get lucky, they would grow. They grow from about a quarter of a millimetre to a third of a millimetre in size over the 10-day period, and we'll watch them incredibly closely with a microscope to try and see how they're growing. Are they growing? If they're not growing, there's not much we can do about it, but then next, this is actually a picture of some of the spat that has settled. So the larvae sticks after 10 days in. It develops a very basic eye, and it sticks to something hard like a mussel shell. So we scatter mussel shell into the ponds to catch the larvae. So you can see on the photo on the right, there's some baby oysters stuck to mussel shell. So it's rather fun as a trademark. So if you buy any of our native oysters, you'll always find a a piece of mussel shell up near the hinge. When coming to the end of the summer, or sometimes we keep the oysters in over the winter, we would drain the pond and we would sweep the shell down the side of the pond very carefully, keeping things underwater as much of the time, and scoop mussel shell and the oyster into baskets, rush them down to the sea on a tractor and trailer. There's our boat, two boats in the background, and then take them out to sea and then shovel them off the boat. And we've got sticks in the corner of the beds, and where the shell lands, it'll stay there for the rest of its life. So you can go back to that exact area in 3 or 4 years' time and harvest your oysters. We lay them very thickly, but that's because an awful lot of them die when you're and we don't have enough space to be able to lay them more thinly. But out of all the ponds, a lot do survive, and then when you come to harvest them, you can get a huge crop quite easily. You may not be able to read the numbers on this, but the excitement from it is that in our best year we produced about a quarter of the production of the French production in value, just from our one farm in Ireland. And our best years ever have been after we've had the Benamia disease. So those are our actual sort of audited figures of the tonnages that we sold, just averaging the different generations of the different survivors. Obviously there's a huge amount of discrepancy with whether you have a good breeding year and a bad breeding year. But we've, since the disease, and the last few years, we were selling 70, 80, 90 tons of native oysters every single year. So we would say that we have an oyster that survives the Benamia disease. This is another discussion for later, but we've then selling an awful lot of oysters, and our fishery has been closed due to a pollution from our local town, causing the oysters to be. So from those figures, we are now closed. So moving quickly on, if I spend too much time, we were then asked in 1996 to come and help farm a farm in southwest Scotland, in Loch Ryan. King William gave the Wallace family the rights to the oysters in Loch Ryan in 1701, and they've owned the rights to the oysters there ever since. So we've been farming that for 21 years. And the Wallace family chose us because they knew about our history from Cork and the fact that we knew about native oysters. This is a chart of the fishery. It's huge. It's absolutely huge, and but it does have a natural spatful of its own. The oysters do breed there. It's the last remaining native oyster bed in Scotland. The water is about 5 meters deep. It's a relatively small tidal range, and the loop on the east side is where we are mostly fishing, and that's a picture of our boat, the Vital Spark. The strategy here is just to take out only the biggest oysters for selling them and leave the youngest oysters on the seabed, but also now when we catch the young ones, we put them into, each year we put them into a small dense area where we can fish them back. And also by placing the young oysters closer together, they have much more chance of fertilizing each other. So we're trying to aid that. And in fact, this by leaving the stock in the sea, that provides more shelly material. The loch itself does not have much shelly material. So previous farmers have placed more culture into the sea, and we're hoping to get a source of mussel shell. And our first load is arriving tomorrow, which is a lot of fun. So we'll be able to get a lot of mussel shell that we can scatter out for culch that will maybe catch the larvae should we get a hot summer. In Scotland we harvest maybe 20 to 30 tonnes a year, about 250,000 oysters. So it's not a huge amount, but it's enough to keep the business going, and in its best year, it produced maybe 100 tons. So we've still got a long way to go. So now we're growing all these oysters in the different farms. We sell them mostly into London. We've got tanks in Sussex at the edge of this crayfish farm, which is a beautiful site. And we've got, we based it there because it's near to airports and generally good access. This is a picture of our shed. We've got 8 tanks that hold about 2 tons of water, but we can hold about 50,000 oysters. There's 2.5 people that work there. One of them packs and the other one delivers. So we're a very small company. And in Valentine's, once we sold 110,000 oysters. That was round the clock packing. It was lovely. There's before you sell an oyster, you have to. The rules in England are you have to decorate it. You have to clean it to make sure it's safe to eat. And the rules are that you have to put them into tanks for 42 hours in clean water. So on that particular week, as soon as a tank was emptied, the next one went in. So the idea, the reason the regulation was set up at 42 is it gives you 6 hours after taking this batch out to get the next one in. So you can do it on a 2-day cycle, which is well nice. There's a huge lot of interest in native oysters. There's been so many areas that have lost so many native oysters. It's really knocked the industry for 6. In fact, there's been about 4 conferences in about 4 months. The European Aquaculture Society is meeting in about 2 weeks to discuss it. There's another meeting in Berlin to try and work out how people want to do things with native oysters. And from Loch Ryan, we've sent oysters to lots of areas, and these are places that we've certainly dealt with, and either sent some of our seed to or in conversations with it. So we would say that pond breeding is certainly a way forward. What we have done is, obviously they cost a fortune to build, but once they're there, it's only a pump to fill it. And we would say that now we have an oyster by producing up to 100 tons of saleable oysters every year. We would argue that we have an oyster that survives the disease. And so at a conference in Berlin in start of November, where we would like to propose, if we could provide this possible resistant stock. It's quite difficult to prove it's resistant, but I don't think anywhere else can produce the fact that, if people phone us up wanting a ton of oysters, that's easy. We have got that behind us. So that's really most about the native oysters. That probably I'd love to answer questions maybe afterwards. We've got more to the tasting side of things. I was just going to say, with our tanks in Sussex, we're ideally placed so other farmers can send us their rock oysters, and so ideally, we export some and we send them into London. So if we can, the more we can deal with, the fresher they all move. So today we're going to be tasting some Jersey oysters. Katie will talk much more about them. These Jersey oysters are grown by a successful man on racks like that and trestles. We're going to taste some from Poole Harbour, where they're grown on the bottom, with a man that harvests them in the most unusual fashion with a conveyor belt. He just lowers his conveyor belt and simply just scoops them all up, and they come up beautifully one by one in a line. And so his shells are fragile, but they're very meaty oyster because they're grown on the bottom. West Mersey rock oysters you might know from Essex. They're big and wild and ugly, and very heavy shell and very, very stony, because they're probably bred intertidally. So we'll have some of those. There's some from Orford in Suffolk, which is a much smaller family business, but they're very, very lovely oysters. And then also some of our native oysters from Scotland. I just had a little thing saying we had a small oyster festival. And that's a picture of the island in Ireland. And I've got a small video. Shall I quickly show a 5-minute thing of, and then I will be.
How long does it take an oyster to come in to be harvested?
Sorry.
What time is it from the spawn to be harvested?
In a normal oyster bed, it'll be about 3 years. The native oyster, dies often in its 3rd summer because of the Banarmian disease, and so in the fowl in Cornwall, they have the disease. They have a reasonable production, 20 tons of native oysters fished by beautiful boats under sail, and it's all very romantic. But their oysters are always just annoyingly too small for a London market. They do get some larger ones, but the bulk of them are just too small.
So
4 years,
the
really.
ponds, 3 years and 3 years, yes? You rotate the ponds?
So we take them out of the pond and put them in the sea for 3 years.
Yes.
But with our crop, if they're too small, we have left them for 4 years, and they have mostly survived, which makes them into a very desirable big oyster, and worth a lot.
So you segment the sea and you go, what is to be harvested? And so in one.
Yes, we peg it out with a there's a pole within a foot. You know exactly where they all are. Yeah. But I'll quickly show you. It's only a nice little small. Can I show you a small video? Or do you want to?
No, yeah.
And then this is a video of our farm in Scotland.
Been fishing oysters here for 400 years, and hopefully will carry on for another 400. I've never really thought about what I would do if I wasn't fishing. Quite happy fishing, I like my job. I'm Robert Lamont, I'm captain of the oyster boat in Stranraer, the White Spark. It was about 25 years ago I started fishing. Fished ever since, whole life spent fishing. John Mills, an oyster farmer in Stranraer. Fished the whole of the British Isles, the Irish Sea, the North Sea, the Clyde, Isle of Man, Loch Rhine. Fish for fish, scallops, greenies, squid. Come out every day nice and peaceful. Every day is different. Some days are windy, some days are sunny, some days are dry. Never the same twice in a row. So it's always nice and peaceful. We only fish months when hard in them. The rest of the time's the breeding season, we're not allowed to fish them. You give them a chance to grow and breed. The last native oyster bed left in Scotland is Loch Rhine. That's why it's so important to protect it. We only take out what we need. Sustainability is very important because you're not just fishing for the now, you're fishing for the future. the sea. Where else would you might be?
Great. So that was just a little clip of Loch Ryan. But I'll pass you on to Katie to talk more about the rock oysters and the different types of rock oysters and her joys and benefits with that.
Thanks.
Great.
Thank you, Tristan. It's lovely to see you in action. I don't think I've actually done that before. I've not seen you presenting. Tristan and I first crossed paths in about 2011 when I was curating and presenting the Great British Oyster Festival at the Southampton Boat Show. And I was lucky enough to be there for 10 days presenting 10 different oysters across each day of the event. And every person who came to my event there got to try all of them, and we were giving them away for free. And it was wonderful because that's what I love to do, is promote oysters and promote their diversity. For example, I would say from my experience across the years, lots of people would think that, would not believe that there are actually oyster farms in the UK in the general population. It's a very sort of, it's a bit of a hidden kind of industry in the UK in general knowledge. I've seen it change over the last 12 years. I've been talking about oysters for quite some time. I've been, like I say, presenting at food festivals, doing masterclasses, and I am currently putting together the inaugural London Oyster Week, which is going to be similar to the Great British Oyster Festival in that we are trying to get as many people as possible trying oysters. There's quite a few reasons behind that. They are one of the most sustainable protein sources on the planet. You know, when there's incredible pressure on land-based protein sources, agriculture, oysters are a fantastic way of alleviating that, and they alleviate that in a really pleasant way because they're incredibly good for you, and they're a natural source of dopamine, so they make you happy too. So essentially, what I'm here today, obviously it's Guild of Food Writers event. Thank you for having me. And one of the things that I've noticed over the years is that a lot of miscommunication happens around oysters. Sometimes in very, very sort of basic, simple ways. I know that there's a lot of pressure on people in the media, and it's not always easy to get exactly what you need when you need it with short deadlines. Fundamentally, as Tristan's mentioned, there are two types of oysters in the UK, farmed and commercially sold. They are the native and the rock. There are no others. And I, just as an illustration in the first stages of what I'm going to be talking about today, I have this website where I am profiling all of the oysters in the UK and Ireland gradually. I say that gradually because Tristan's not on there yet, but I'm hoping to get some samples. Yeah, I'll just whip some of these home with me to photograph. But what I'm trying to do with this is kind of raise awareness of oyster culture because it's very similar to wine culture. You have the same species of oyster. We've got two species on this little list here. All of them but one are the same species. This one here is obviously the Foul Bay native oyster. Exactly the same species as Tristan's Loch Ryan, but it will taste and look a little bit different. Mostly just size. I find there's not a huge amount of variation in the way that a native looks between different appellations. But when it comes to the rock oyster, you get incredibly varied kind of shells and shapes, sizes, and as I said, it's very similar to wine culture, and this is what this website's all about. It helps explain, come on, is it going to work? It's a way of describing oysters we'll get there, I can see it's going to load, in the same way you would a wine. So, I know oysters have a certain reputation, but that's just silly. So, let me try that one more time. Is there any reason why it would be blocked? Is it working? As soon as I gave up. You know the way that people would taste a wine with you do the nose first with the smell. do exactly the same with an oyster. It's really intriguing. What I find when I'm dealing with people when they're eating oysters at a stand, they'll tend to often knock them down whole in one. And I always say that's kind of like, you imagine if you had a really fine wine, put it in a shot glass, held your nose up, like it was a Jägermeister. Sorry, Jägermeister. But I see that they're trying to make them into a bit more of an exclusive drink with London Cocktail Week at the moment. But so yeah, they are, you know, you wouldn't do that with an oyster. It's a waste of time, but many people do. Many people who've been eating oysters for 10, 20 years have been doing it wrong their whole lives. And I've had the experience of people having revelations in front of me at oyster stands where I'd say, well, no, don't swallow it whole. Try this, just take your time, you know, have a sip of the liquor first and savour that, and it gets your palate going. We call the juice in oysters, it's quite fanciful. We call the juice in oysters liquor, oyster liquor, because it does contain quite a lot of the flavour of the oyster, and it doesn't taste just like seawater. Everyone says it's, you know, I can see your head shaking and nodding. Yeah, I'm glad you agree with me. It's part of the whole, what we call merroir of the oyster, which is very similar to terroir of wine. So this is a Porphyry rock. It's a rock oyster, Crass Austria Gigas, and it happens to be half an hour from my house, this oyster farm. As I said, I'm promoting oyster culture the same way as wine, and so we've got the kind of the same as you'd have with a vineyard and its variety of grape. You have the same details. So the merroir, the flavours, textures and characteristics. You look carefully at the nose, the body and the finish. And I also look at the salinity and the meat to shell ratio. Salinity is quite important because it also helps you identify where an oyster comes from in terms of whether it's estuarine, whether it's close to the intertidal zone, or if it's actually farmed out in the deeper ocean. It will obviously be a lot more salty if it's out further in the ocean. That's Tim and his son Luke, who are the farmers down in Rocks. I think it's really important to profile our farmers as well. As I said, quite often we have oysters in the press and they're kind of misrepresented. I like this little shot of a Carlingford oyster because to me that is like the perfect oyster. Beautiful teardrop shape oyster with a lovely meat to shell ratio, and it's a really lovely full oyster. The reason why I'm talking about the importance of photography as well is because a fantastic feature was done about my work in the Sunseeker International. They did an 8-page spread, and it was bigger than A4 but not quite A3, I'm not sure, I'm not very good with those kind of things. It's about that big. And I was really excited about it until I saw this. And that was a whole page photo. And one of the reasons that it was of concern to me in terms of my work and in terms of oyster culture in general is because in 2015, I think it was, or 14, the oyster was voted at the top of the list of things that the British public was likely to try. So we're talking about people not even trying it, not like, oh, I've had one and I don't like it. They actually topped the list out of 3. The other 2 were liver and anchovies. All 3 of those things I absolutely love. But oysters are at the top of the list. And if you're talking about something that people aren't even trying, it's because of their perception of it in the first place. And I think that's where, you know, you guys as journalists have a brilliant position to change that, change it positively. And I think, again, photography, if you're trying to convince people to eat something, you want it to look as appetizing as possible. So, yeah. I mean, in a sort of straw poll, would you go for that or would you go for that?
Yeah, but why has it got the black marks, that oyster?
This one here,
Yes.
that's just the gills. You've got the same here, it's just not as noticeable because this oyster's a lot fatter. Yeah, so it's all pushed out to the edge. But you'll find as well, quite often, the striations of the shell here will reflect in the actual gills of the oyster. So you'll see sometimes, see how it goes black, white, black, white, black, white. You'll actually see that across this part in exactly the same position, which is quite fascinating as well.
What's the best season to eat oysters? Because people say this is not the season to eat oysters, that's the season.
Okay, rock oysters can be eaten at any time of the year. There are 2 types of rock oyster. They're the same species, but it's actually farmers harnessing something that happens naturally. You've got a diploid, which is a normal oyster that breeds in the same way that the native oyster does in the summer. So that's when it spawns. So it loses its body and meat because it's busy with sort of sending its nutrients out in the form of sperm and eggs. So what they've done is develop the triploid. That happens naturally, like I say, in oyster populations, but they've actually managed to kind of contain the breeding so that they can use the triploid for farming and it doesn't spawn, which means that it will be a consistent oyster all year round. And there's no like nasty genetic modification or, there's nothing harmful about it. It's just a really handy way of getting consistent oysters all year round. And I think it's a great thing because, summer's a lovely time to have oysters. Were you going to ask a question then?
I was wondering why diploid and triploid?
I'm not 100% sure what the sort of root of the word, the sort of reason for the names are. Maybe it's kind of, because I know that, do you know?
Yeah, it's biology.
Oh, did you? Biology lesson.
Years ago, and I'm trying to remember this. It's a difference in one of the chromosomes.
Yeah, I thought it, yeah. There we go, chromosome difference. You would imagine that most people would know the difference between a rock and a native. We've seen here on the website it's going to be blocked on everyone. You've got the very obvious shapes and sizes difference in the rock and the native. As was brought to my attention by Tristan because of what I'm talking about today, this came out just yesterday, so the date on the article, Monday, October 2nd, Galway Bay community aims to save the native oyster. And they're leading with a photo of Pacific oysters. So it's still as much as we're out there with all of this engagement, interaction, and outreach, the problem still persists. And it's quite interesting because they're even talking about them with their Latin names. They're like they really know what they're talking about, but they don't. But this is one of the reasons why I set this website up. I believe oyster culture is really important, and like I said, it's not just because of how they taste nice. They're really, really good for us, and they take pressure off of other protein sources. I was recently attending the World Oyster Society's symposium in Wales, and they were presenting about the health benefits of oysters as well. And there's even companies now putting together oyster extract because it is that effective at combating stress, depression, and anxiety, because it's jam-packed with zinc, DHA, omegas, all of them. So they're really, really good for you.
When you do them, when you cook it, like put it on the grill with some sauce on top, do they lose the health benefit?
No, they don't. They don't lose that. You're not, if you kind of crucify them in the oven, then maybe. But if you just gently poach them like they're meant to be.
The sauce on top and put on the grill.
No, they won't lose their nutritional benefit from that at all. No, it's still.
Sometimes you have oysters, they're very crispy, they're really fantastic. And some other times they're a little bit slimy, not so great. What's happened to them?
Crispy, as in when you've cooked them.
Beautiful and crispy.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Sorry,
Yeah, okay. So you're saying that they have a nice sharp, like there's like almost al dente bite to them.
Like glass, fantastic.
That could be, yeah. I kind of, again, with some of the descriptions on this website, we talk about how the firmness of the bite, and you get a real firmness of bite in the native oyster, actually, don't you? There's a lot more density to the bite. It's just a matter of, what time of year, the area they grow in, the different types of nutrients, and that's all to do with the appellation and the merroir that we're talking about. I'm a big proponent of, you mentioned cooking, a way of getting more people involved in oysters is actually to cook them. There can be people that would say, it's a purist thing, you shouldn't cook oysters, but if they can give me a reason why, then I'd happily listen. But I haven't seen anyone come up with a good one yet. So this is another aspect
just
of...
add one thing in there.
Yes, Colin, go
is
for it.
Is that I found I sold lots of oysters in my restaurants over the years, But to introduce people to oysters, if you just put them, we used to say, frighten them under the grill, just to put that little bit of texture in,
Yep.
so people get over the sort of frightening thing of having a live wriggling mollusk in their mouth.
I've never had one wriggle in my mouth, Colin.
But it would get people over that, and they would soon
I agree.
gradually want to take them.
I have a little exercise called the stealth oyster dish, and it's very much along those lines, but it takes it a step further, because quite often, even when they've cooked them, and if it's in a half shell, it can be daunting still, because they're looking at it and they're going, visually, like for example, do you want to eat that? No, I really don't. So I've been working on a lot of different recipes, and stealth oyster recipes are one of my favourite things, because I have a 99.99999% conversion rate on oyster virgins or dislikers, apart from if they've got an allergy or if they're incredibly strict vegans. Even there is actually a sector of veganism, by the way, that eats oysters, and they call it the Ostra-vegan, because they're convinced, because of their nutritional value, and because of their ethical nature, that they are essentially a mushroom in a shell. They can live with that. There's no central nervous system, so they're happy going for it. So those are the basic ingredients, if you even just cut out the garnish in the middle. So you've got essentially 4 basic ingredients for my stealth oyster dish, which ends up looking like that. Now, to the untrained eye, that just looks like a carbonara. But I'm going to play a little video now as well. We're really high tech, aren't we, these days? It's just a very brief video of how to turn prehistoric living creatures into a pasta dish, so that even the biggest oyster doubters will go for it. So that's kind of like the mission I've been on for probably about 10 to 12 years now, and just ramping things up at the moment with putting on London Oyster Week in April, which is going to be a massive awareness raising activity. And we're going to be working with Blue Marine Foundation, who were briefly mentioned on Tristan's presentation. They're restoring the native oyster beds in the Solent, and all funds raised will be going towards their oyster restoration efforts. As you can see, it's very simple. Anyone could make this. By the way, you don't have to trim the gills. That was just a way of having a very nice, pure, creamy sauce, very finicky. But if you're going for presentation, that's why. It's the same as, you know, with white pepper and black pepper and sauces. Don't look at the rest of them. So yeah, do you know how I get off with that? There we go. So yeah, cooking oysters and creating a culture around them in the same way as wine. And this little, sorry about the blocking, guys. Taking that oyster culture theory a step further, it occurred to me some time ago to get in touch with the Master of Wine and WSET folk, because I wanted to know how they started. And it was 60 years ago, basically, they set up their Master of Wine with an exam to kind of find the best of the best in wine culture. And I believe that oysters deserve the same, and that's what the Oyster Academy is. And we'll be working on training from just basic workshop level to get people introduced to qualifications in Australia culture, in the same way you have a sommelier, because I believe that this will help the industry, both from farming all the way through to service in restaurants. And where you're selling more oysters, you get healthier people, happier people, and healthier oceans as well. I think that's probably enough for me, because we'll probably want to get on to some Q&As and actually taste some oysters. But if you've got any specific questions about London Oyster Week, Australia, workshops or masterclasses, then fire away.
Tristan, you mentioned earlier about the feeding of the oysters. I assume they just have the plankton that are going that's in the seawater. Do you take any other special measures?
The answer is no. We don't. A hatchery does. A hatchery with its microscope they spend all their lives trying to make food. They have there's different foods. There's something called Tetracelamis, Isis, which are two algal blooms, and it's quite simple. You just give them a nice nutrient-rich water, and you seed them with a little bit of your sunlight, and it grows in the water. And you can see there's a man in Whitstable who's pioneered a sterile plastic bag that sits inside a metal frame, and if you bubble air through it, you can see the coloration going. The water goes in clean, and if you take a little green bit of another tank and you tip the green bit into the new tank, then the new tank blooms up with the same cell that you've seeded it with. But as soon as you get sort of bacteria and stuff, then these populations crash, and there's a crisis. But in our ponds, our skill is to fill them at the right time of year. So we watch the plankton in the estuary to see what is there, and to see whether it's stirred up and silty, or whether it's a calm, neap tides, spring tides. Things are different. And then when you fill a pond, the temperature increases quite a lot, quite quickly, hopefully with the sun, and then you get a bloom, you get a diatom bloom, and that quickly collapses, and then the pond gets more of a natural equilibrium. But we don't feed the pond at all. We can't. We've got too many ponds, and the pump couldn't keep up. And I think once you start chucking in a bit of fertiliser, which is all we would really do, we've tried putting bubble wrap over the pond to increase the temperature, but then you get all sorts of weed and chaos going on in your pond, and no oxygen goes in.
And how many oysters to the ton? I can't remember.
There's 10,000. Market size, there's 10,000.
To call it, how many dozen oysters would be much more?
Well, there's 10.
How many portions?
There'll be a thousand dozen to a ton.
Okay.
Yeah, it's about 100. It's about 10,000 oysters per ton. So yeah, it's a pallet. A pallet of oysters about this high. Let's get the first oyster. Yeah. We've got some. I think we'll start off with some Jersey rock oysters. I'll bring some oysters through, and then you can all taste them, and then we'll ask questions while we taste.
Yeah.
So
That would be lovely.
like, so you don't do like a top up of wine or beer?
Do you want beer at this stage? Are we okay with that, or would you rather have it after the oyster tasting? We've got some oyster stout. Would you rather leave that until after the oyster?
I think that if everyone can, you can have oyster stout with the native oyster, because that's a really nice traditional way of doing it.
We can maybe go around.
They're going to be last.
Separately,
Okay.
yeah.
It's going to be last. Yeah.
Here we are. So these are some Jersey oysters. These.
Actually, nice, yeah.
That's a good question.
That's your job. Yeah.
Basically,
It's a Jersey oyster.
take your time. That's the most important thing. So, yes, 100% chew. Yeah. Your natural instinct will tell you.
That's the one that was grown on trestles. It's got. I would say it's got a perfect shell shape. If you had your shell, it's a nice little cupped shell, but the meat content in it. I mean, it's a delicious taste, but it's not as necessarily plump as an oyster that actually sits on the bottom. Not many farmers grow their oysters sitting on the seabed, but the one we're going to try now is from Poole Harbour, and that's the man who harvests them with a sort of conveyor system. So he buys his seed oysters from a hatchery. He then grows them actually hanging off a boat in a sort of nursery system. And when their oyster is about the size of my thumb, he'll chuck them onto the seabed, and then they'll grow on the seabed.
How do they actually lift them off the seabed then?
He has this boat with a conveyor. I could.
It's got like a forward-facing tight or something.
He's got a conveyor belt that would ease them off the bottom.
Okay.
So do you want to take?
Yeah.
If you take one on that side. So these are the pool ones.
Yeah.
Yes. They are slightly larger, but you'll find that the meat fills the shell well. So these are. We'll finish with a native at the end, but these are all rock oysters. But these are rock oysters that are grown on the bottom, so they're slightly meatier, and the shell hasn't too disturbed. the trays. It was trays. The rival trays. You get them fast from the trays.
Just enterprising restaurateurs.
Well, no demand was, demand from Paris was significant. So when demand went down.
Westminster. Can I just quickly say about the next one we'll taste? Are you ready for the next one? From West Mersey.
Sorry.
That's right. They're all neighbours. These ones, yes, have got a sort of heavy, ugly shell. The hinge is often the wrong way round because they settle on gravel, and they're much more difficult to open. If you have a choice of opening them, I would not recommend these. The Jersey ones are the weakest to open, so they're the most joyful to pop open. These are like old stones. They're used to being out of the sea, and when they're out of the sea, you can leave these in the back of your car for a week, and they'll all be fine. They're very, very solid. And the interesting thing is these ones breed in the wild. So off Southend and in West Mersey, these are wild rock oysters, and there's a huge debate at the moment whether this is it's called an invasive non-native species or whether it's a naturalized species. There are clams in Poole Harbour there's a huge business, there's a great success and all sorts of conservation measures for a clam that has invaded Poole Harbour, which is delicious to eat, and people are farming it and fishing it, and there's a thriving business. It's the same with this rock oyster. The farmers in Essex and other parts of the world have this wild oyster, but therefore haven't quite decided whether it's a naturalized species or an invasive non-native species. And if it was an invasive one, it should be eradicated. And that is the end of the entire shellfish business.
My introduction to oysters was when I was 12 years old on a holiday in France, family holiday. And at the time we were living in central Bristol, so we didn't know what oysters were. It was the 1980s. My dad was like, wow, there's oysters in the local market, and he brought them back to our campsite.
Stop press. We've got a pearl. Right here.
Oh my God!
I didn't put it in, I promise. It wasn't from my oyster. It was a Poole Harbour rock oyster.
No way.
It's only the second time I've ever seen a pearl of that size in a rock oyster.
That is amazing!
It's a big pearl. It's the biggest pearl I've seen.
Just pop that next to the
Okay, just to illustrate how unusual this is, for 12 years I've been opening thousands and thousands of oysters, and I have never found a pearl, let alone one that size.
A rock oyster is particularly. I've had them in native oysters, but never rock oysters.
Oh, so you've become a museum piece.
Amazing.
Somebody has to take a photograph for me.
That's amazing. That must be lucky. Yeah, well, looking very surprised.
So yeah, nice firm blade. You want it. I like this one because it's got a good narrow point, because some of them tend to be about this wide and they're a bit useless in my opinion. I do a little thing like, with cigars when they clip the ends off. I do a little pop like that. Huh? Not me, but if anybody else is doing it, I would recommend a cloth around this end, because quite often people believe that it's the knife that's dangerous. It's not at all, it's this. It's like the worst paper cut you'll ever get. So it's incredibly fine and incredibly sharp. So recommend a cloth around the oyster to hold it, but the knife is not the dangerous bit. So yeah, I've popped off the end. It gives it easier access at the hinge. You can see very clearly the difference between the hinge and the cut end here. And it's kind of almost like it's telling you where to go. So you go in there. Yeah, it's basically push like this, and then always move it side to side. Follow the line of the oyster. You can see the line of the shell opening is there. Lots of people go wiggle wiggle like that, and they just mash it up, and the shell gets everywhere. And you're also breaking the shell, so it makes it harder to actually get the leverage. So just in like so. I probably should have a cloth. Then just twist, and you twist it that way, and once you're in, did you see? So you push side to side. Once you're in, then a pop.
Okay.
And then once, this is what I do anyway, once you're there, I put my finger over the top, thumb in there, and then you can go in and get a really clean cut of the adductor muscle, which is the bit that holds the top shell on. It's a bivalve mollusk, so the valves are the shells. And the adductor muscle goes all the way through. So it's up for debate. In some restaurants, you wouldn't cut this adductor muscle. You'd serve it like that with a nice fork with a sort of sharp edge on one of the sides. I'm quite keen on cutting it and popping it over, essentially because it's a really good way of making sure it's detached properly, so you haven't got people going like this with it dangling above their faces and causing them embarrassment. But it's a good way of checking for extra shell fragment inside the oyster. Yeah, so you just flat of the knife and pop it over. And always use the flat, don't start poking around because you'll cut up the oyster then. So flat of the knife and then a little slide, and it's a really nice presentation then, and you're guaranteed that it's detached.
You don't remove anything or cut anything?
No, the only thing you have to remove is the top shell, and if there's any sort of little bits of shell fragment, the rest of it you want to eat as much of as possible. So that's why you want to cut it as cleanly as possible. You see the dark patch on the shell, that's where the adductor muscle is. You want to slice that as cleanly as possible so there's no meat left on there.
Beautifully open, might I add.
Pardon?
Beautifully open, might I add.
Thank you very much.
There is a British oyster. Sorry, so there's a British oyster opening championship that happens at the start of September every year, of which the rules are there's a race who can open 30 oysters the fastest. We supply the oysters, and all of London's top chefs crack on with it, and they take about 3 minutes to open 30 oysters. This year I won the Scottish Oyster Opening Championships because we had a festival in Stranraer on our oyster farm. So it was slightly cheating because I never won the London one, to arrange my own festival in Scotland. And win it. And so I then went to the World Oyster Opening Championships, which was in Galway last 2 weekends ago. And there was 22 countries, and it was an absolute riot. And the man who won it was a man from Estonia.
He won it last year as well, didn't he?
And he did it in 2 minutes 15, 2 minutes 15 seconds,
And
30 oysters, and they were absolutely beautiful. I spent a long time making sure these were all as good as I could, and I was worried that you were going to pick me up on how lousily they were opened. But he did it in 2 minutes and 15, which was
that's crazy. And you know our little friend Federico from Bentley's?
Oh yes.
His first ever time, and he came 4th in the World Champs.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
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 Having just lost my oyster virginity.
Hooray!
How was it for you?
So oysters have feelings?
No central nervous system.
Right.
So what I was saying earlier about Ostroveganism, yeah, they basically say it's essentially like a mushroom in a shell. Probably less kind of elaborate than a mushroom from what I've heard on mushroom research lately.
I'm just going to. I'm going to pass these around. These are the authored ones
They're
from
lovely.
Suffolk.
Yeah.
They're a beautiful, nice shell shape, and yeah, from a smaller family business, really.
Is it correct, Tristan, that the guy grows them in mushroom boxes in the estuary?
He has got some, yeah. I don't know if they're.
Yeah, these are the ones from Suffolk, Butley Creek. Yeah.
He has got photos of. I don't know if they really work.
Oh, okay.
But
So it's just
I have seen photos of them.
different oysters. Has anyone got any observations? Hand up, and we'll have a lady at the back. Katie?
The pool one
Yeah.
was huge and extremely meaty.
Uh-huh.
I'm not sure I enjoyed it that much.
Okay.
It went on too long.
And so, obviously, size matters. I think that in terms of eating raw on the half shell, the small one is really the best you can go for, especially if it's the first time as well. You don't want to overwhelm somebody, like make them feel like they're drowning on dry ground. Flavour profile, any observations on flavours?
I thought the bottom ground ones are very earthy.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense. And what were you
The
saying?
Orford one.
The Orford one,
The
yeah.
Orford one was very nice. It was very tasty. Yeah, the better taste. It was quite sweet.
Sweet.
It was quite not like an oyster, to be honest. When you were eating it, it was quite pleasant. Where
Yeah, I mean, what we do with tastings, again, one of the reasons why we're talking about the whole wine culture, oyster culture, because we look at things like vegetal, mineral, and I actually say animal, because I ate some oysters in the Sahara in January. There's an oyster farm down there, believe it or not. Fantastic oysters, and they have a real gamey sort of animal kind of mineral. It's lovely. It is lovely, and it's funny. What's that? Well, it's the Sahara, the coast. It's a lagoon. Yeah, right down on the border with Mauritania. The heat. But the water's still quite cold because it's the Atlantic, and they actually grow very quickly. He can get commercial size within a year, which is pretty amazing. I don't know. I'm all about the flavour and the, yeah. Tristan will probably know more about because the first one was the Jersey oyster. Yeah. Was it strong in terms of salinity?
Just, yes, the general sort of taste of sea.
Yeah.
Was my
Yeah.
very nice.
And it's very interesting because that's an illustration of the, you know, again, the same species of oyster, the Jersey and the Orford and the pool one, completely different flavour profiles.
Really interesting.
Yeah.
How would you describe the profile, say, the Jersey?
The Jersey ones, they're a lot saltier basically. The salinity is a lot heavier. They're further out in the ocean. They've got more ozone, a lighter kind of vegetal balance there. Not like, I mean, I have to agree, as much as I don't like criticism of any oysters, the pool ones were a bit too of like the kind of bottom grown earthy flavour for me. So I prefer ones with a bit more salinity. It went quiet behind me then. I was like,
I was going to say there's the reason we've started to trade in the pool oysters is
trading.
Yeah, is that people do some people do like bigger ones.
Yeah.
There's a big demand from France for sort of smaller oysters, which are probably not 50% more in price, but there's a huge price difference. The man in pool his oysters got ahead of him. He can't keep up with harvesting them, whatever, they've grown too quickly. So he's now got a surplus of these slightly bigger oysters that he needs to urgently sell.
I would say in that circumstance that would be a perfect time for experimenting with recipes and cooking, because when they're bigger like that, they lend themselves really well because the flavour profile changes quite significantly. If you cook it even without any addition, just poached in its own liquor, the taste of like the liquor from a sort of ozone salinity taste of the ocean, it thickens up to like a umami bouillabaisse kind of richness just from the process of cooking. So it's amazing.
You don't put them in, just poach them in their hard shell.
Yeah, that's one way. I also, if you haven't got a knife, you don't feel comfortable, you can actually do what I call the pressure cooker oyster. And it's best to, if you're going to do it in the oven, you need a tray underneath because it gets messy. But they they literally cook like a pressure cooker in their own shell, poach nicely, and it's nice because it retains a lot of the moisture then, and the oyster doesn't get overcooked.
And then does the shell open?
Yeah, it either explodes, which is when I say if you're doing it on a campfire, always make sure you've got the hinge end pointed towards you and this end pointed towards the person you don't like, because they shoot out hot water. It can be quite dangerous actually.
Also, you can do them in a microwave.
Yes.
You put half a dozen in the microwave for 10-15 seconds. If they need another few, till they're just gaping,
just to get them
and
open.
you can then slide your knife in very easily. If you want to eat them raw, just pop them in the fridge till they're cool. If you want them cooked, just pop them under the grill with a bit of whatever.
Yeah.
They're still totally raw, but they're tiède at that stage. You weaken them, and they are remarkably good. And it's dead easy.
Yeah. But yeah, so you can just poach, like, if you can shuck, then you can put them in the, like your grill's got the kind of little struts, like, or in your oven. It just sits between the pieces like that, and that stops it rolling and spilling its liquor. And then you can put, like, really simple toppings on. One of my favourite is just a tiny bit of garlic and rosemary, and I call it the roast dinner in a half shell. And when it cooks, it's literally like the never-ending gobstopper of oysters. It's literally like a roast dinner. So I think somebody wanted to know the difference between natives and rocks again, didn't they? Just the reason why we took a little break there as well is because this is what they would say is the connoisseur's oyster, wouldn't they? The native, the oyster lover's oyster.
I think so. Right? It's rare. It's rare. Yeah, certainly.
So yeah, we just like in terms of paying attention to the flavours, really.
The texture's different, the flavour's different.
Yeah.
The
And
shell's different.
the size.
They breed differently to the rock oyster.
Yeah, again, the texture, like we were saying about that bite, the firmness of bite. There's a lot of that in these. You wanna? Oh, do you want a hand with that?
Could do in a second, but I just wanted to introduce it very, very briefly. Those of you who came to our beer event will have encountered Jim Hamilton and the beers from her nephew's brewery, Hamilton Brewery, oddly enough. And they were actually the first brewery to revive the tradition of putting oysters in stout. You actually do put oysters in the stout to produce oyster stout. So there we go. It's called Pentonville, so this is stout with oysters fermented, brewed in it.
And these are...
So I've got, in case you don't want to put it in your wine glasses, we've got, if you can pass this on, that's great. You'll have to go around the side. Bottle.
And these are the lock
I think probably the
about
6
10 years old.
bottles round.
Oh, okay. No, none for you? No? Do you want to